The blizzard screamed across the Colorado high plains like 1,000 banshees driving snow horizontal through the darkness, with the fury of winter's dying breath. Ruth Caldwell stumbled forward through drifts that reached her knees, her 8-year-old son Will, burning with fever in her arms, each step sending shards of agony through legs that had lost all feeling hours ago. Behind them, barely audible above the howling wind, came the distant baying of tracking dogs and the orange flicker of torches cutting through the storm. Fort Bryer hadn't given up the hunt, even in weather that could kill a man in minutes. Mama, Will whispered against her chest, his voice thin as paper. "I can't. The cold hurts inside my chest." Ruth's heart clenched like a fist. The fever had been climbing for 3 days, ever since they'd fled the town that had once been home. She pulled him closer, feeling his small body shaking with chills, even as his skin burned through her thin shawl. The rock through their cabin window seemed like a lifetime ago now, along with a note tied to it. "Murderer. Get out, or we'll finish what we started." Her boot caught in a hidden root, and she went down hard, Will spilling from her arms into the snow that glittered like scattered diamonds in the minimal moonlight. She crawled toward him on hands that had lost all feeling, pulled him back against her chest. His breathing was shallow, rapid, the fever winning its war against his small body. "Thomas." The memory hit her like a physical blow, her husband 3 nights before his death, pressing something cold and wet into her hand in the pre-dawn darkness. His wedding ring coated in blood that was still warm. "Ruth." He'd whispered, his voice shaking with fear she'd never heard before. "If something happens to me, remember, trust no one in town. The truth is hidden where we first kissed. Find it. Make them pay." She'd found the ring hidden in their woodpile the morning after his funeral, along with a note in his handwriting. "The bell tower. Evidence of everything. Tell our son his father tried to do right." The rest had been too damaged by blood and weather to read, but those words had burned themselves into her memory. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered into Will's burning forehead as the storm raged around them like the wrath of an angry god. "I couldn't save your daddy. I can't even save you." That's when she heard it cutting through the wind, the steady, rhythmic crunch of hooves in snow, moving with purpose rather than panic. Ruth looked up, squinting through the driving flakes, and saw a dark shape emerging from the storm, like something out of fever dreams. A rider tall and straight in the saddle, his wide-brimmed hat crusted with ice, his horse stepping sure-footed through drifts that had defeated her completely. "Please," she called out, her voice cracking like breaking glass. "My son, he's dying. If you're here to finish what they started back in town, just take me. But help him first, please." The rider dismounted without a word and approached slowly, his movements careful and deliberate as a stalking wolf. When he knelt beside her, Ruth saw dark eyes in a weathered copper face, black hair braided with silver beads that caught what little light filtered through the storm. A Navajo. Her blood chilled even further. If the townspeople discovered a Navajo had helped her, they'd call it proof of every lie they'd spread about her supposed treachery. "Both," he said simply, his voice deep and steady as bedrock. "I take both of you." Before Ruth could protest or even understand what was happening, he lifted Will with surprising gentleness, then helped her to her feet with strength that seemed to flow directly from the mountains themselves. The storm tried to knock them down, but somehow his presence held them all upright against its fury. "Can you ride?" he asked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Ruth nodded, though she wasn't sure her frozen legs would support her weight in a saddle. The warrior, for that's what he was, she could see it in the way he moved, like smoke over water, helped her onto his horse, then climbed up behind, with Will cradled between them, like precious cargo. As they rode into the white darkness, leaving the distant sounds of pursuit behind, Ruth felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death: hope. But she also felt terror deeper than the mountain cold, because she knew that in helping her, This stranger had just signed his own death warrant. And she still didn't understand why anyone would risk their life for the woman Fort Briar had marked for death. The storm swallowed their tracks within minutes, but Ruth knew it wouldn't hide them forever. Behind them, men with guns and hatred in their hearts would be waiting for dawn to resume the hunt. Ahead lay only wilderness and the slim chance that they might find shelter before the cold claimed them all. But for the first time in months, she wasn't facing that darkness alone. Set up Fort Briar crouched at the base of Razor Ridge like a wounded animal licking its scars, its weathered buildings and muddy streets bearing witness to the kind of desperate hope that drove people to the edge of the civilized world. The settlement had been carved from the wilderness 3 years ago by folks who believed hard work and good intentions could make anything grow, even in soil that seemed more suited to graves than gardens. Ruth had arrived there full of that same hope, her hand warm in Thomas's, as they'd looked out over the valley that would become their home. The memory of that day, the way the morning light had painted the mountains gold, and the way Thomas had whispered promises about the life they'd build together, now felt like something that had happened to different people in a different world. Thomas Caldwell had been a good man in a place where good men didn't always survive. Quiet and hard-working with gentle hands that could coax life from the rockiest ground, and a smile that made even the harshest winters seem bearable. He'd built their cabin with his own hands, worked his mining claim with the patience of a man who understood that the earth gave up its treasures slowly, and served on the town council because he believed someone had to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The official story of his death was clean as a Sunday sermon mining accident cave-in, tragic but common in territory, where men tunneled into mountains that had been standing since before Christ walked the earth. The kind of accident that reminded everyone how fragile their hold on life really was in country that could kill you for a moment's carelessness. But Ruth knew better. She'd seen the fear creeping into Thomas's eyes the week before he died, watched him burn the papers in their fireplace with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. The night before his last trip to the claim, he'd held her close in their bed and whispered words that still echoed in her nightmares. Some folks in this town aren't what they seem, Ruth. If something happens to me, remember the truth matters more than safety. And trust no one. No one. Something had happened. And the truth had died with him buried beneath 6 feet of earth and 6 months of lies. The rumors had started small as seeds but grown like poison oak. Conversations that stopped when she entered Hendrick's General Store. Invitations to church socials that dried up like streams in summer. Neighbors who suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere when she approached on the street. Then came the whispers spreading through Fort Briar like smoke from a wildfire. Ruth Caldwell meeting someone up at the claim. Ruth Caldwell carrying on with another man while her husband worked. Ruth Caldwell knowing more about Thomas's death than a grieving widow should. Jed Connors, who wore the sheriff's badge like a crown and carried himself with the authority of a man who'd never been told no, had been the one to give voice to what everyone was thinking. Standing on the saloon steps like a preacher delivering judgment, his voice carrying down the street with the weight of divine pronouncement. I'm not saying she killed him, but a woman who betray her marriage bed might betray other sacred trusts. These are dangerous times. What with tensions running high between settlers and the local tribes. Can't afford to harbor folks whose loyalties might run in questionable directions. The town's mood had shifted that day, like weather before a tornado. The very air seeming to thicken with suspicion and barely contained violence. Ruth had tried to defend herself, demanding proof of these accusations, but her protests had fallen on ears already stopped against reason. People wanted someone to blame for the fear that lived in their hearts, someone to point at when the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight seemed too vast and threatening to bear. Abel Pike had been the worst of them, though he'd hidden his venom behind a mask of wounded friendship. Thomas's former mining partner, the man who'd found the body and wept convincing tears at the funeral, had also been Ruth's suitor before she'd chosen Thomas. His bitterness had fermented over the years, like grain left too long in the barrel, turning sweet memory into something toxic and explosive. "I seen things," he'd muttered one Sunday after church, his voice carrying just far enough to be overheard by the cluster of women waiting for their husbands. Things that make a man wonder about a woman's true nature and the kinds of secrets she might keep. The final blow had come 3 nights ago when someone she'd never know who threw that rock through her cabin window. The note tied to it with rough twine had been composed in block letters that could have belonged to anyone. "Murderer, get out or we'll finish what we started." Ruth had spent that night holding Will close, listening to his cough worsen, and feeling his forehead grow hot with fever, knowing that staying in Fort Bryer meant death for both of them, but not knowing where else they could go. Thomas's cousin in Denver might take them in, but Denver was 200 miles of hard travel through country that could kill the healthy and strong, let alone a sick child and his desperate mother. When the blizzard hit the next evening, she'd made the choice that probably damned them both. If they would leave in the storm, using the weather as cover to escape the town's growing hostility. Better to die free in the wilderness than wait for a lynch mob to finish what fear and lies had started. Now, as the Navajo warrior's horse carried them through the howling darkness, Ruth pressed her face against Will's burning forehead and wondered if she'd simply traded one death for another. Behind them, Fort Bryer disappeared into the white void, but she knew the town's hatred would follow them like wolves following blood scent. Their rescuer had said nothing since helping them onto his horse, but Ruth could feel the controlled tension in his body, the way he constantly scanned the storm-torn landscape for threats or shelter. This was a man accustomed to danger, someone who understood that survival often depended on making hard choices quickly and living with the consequences. "What's your name?" she called over the wind. He was quiet for so long she thought he hadn't heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief and older anger. "Tenebah. In your tongue it means, he who leads in war. Are you leading a war?" Another long silence, filled only by the storm's fury and the rhythmic crunch of hooves in snow. "Once. Now I fight different battles." The answer raised more questions than it settled, but Ruth found herself strangely comforted by his presence, despite the cultural gulf between them. This man had risked his life to save strangers in a storm that could kill them all, and that act of mercy spoke louder than any words about the kind of person he might be. But even as temporary safety surrounded them, and the immediate danger of freezing to death receded, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that their real troubles were just beginning. Somewhere behind them in the storm, decisions were being made by men with guns and badges and the righteous fury of people who'd already decided on guilt and innocence. When morning came and the weather cleared, those decisions would come looking for them with tracking dogs and hemp rope, and the absolute certainty that justice was on their side. The storm might hide them for now, but storms always ended eventually. And when this one did, they would need more than luck and the kindness of strangers to survive what came after. Ruth closed her eyes and held her son closer, listening to the wind carry away the last echoes of the life they'd left behind. Whatever lay ahead, death or salvation, justice or continued persecution, they would face it together. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Inciting incident. The cave carved itself into the mountainside like an open mouth, its entrance partially hidden by wind-blown snow and icicles that hung like teeth from the rocky overhang. Tenebah guided his horse through the narrow opening with the confidence of someone who had sheltered here before. And Ruth felt warmth beginning to replace the killing cold as they moved deeper into the earth's embrace. Inside, the cave opened into a space larger than her cabin, back in Fort Bryer, stretching back into darkness that swallowed their voices and echoed with the whisper of centuries. But near the entrance, someone had built a fire pit, surrounded by carefully placed stones, and kindling lay stacked against the wall, as if waiting for exactly this moment. Tenebah dismounted and helped Ruth down with hands that remained steady despite the brutal cold they'd just escaped. Will hung limp in her arms, his breathing shallow and rapid, his skin burning with fever that seemed to consume him from within, like a fire fed by desperation rather than wood. "Lay him here," Tenebah said, indicating a pile of furs and blankets that appeared to be permanent fixtures of this sanctuary. "Near the fire. Warmth will help, but slowly. Too much too fast will shock his body." Ruth settled Will onto the makeshift bed, smoothing damp hair back from his burning forehead, while Tenebah built up the fire with movements that spoke of long practice. Sparks danced upward toward the cave's ceiling, and gradually warmth began to push back the cold that had tried to claim them all. "Where did all this come from?" Ruth asked, gesturing at the supplies that seemed to fill every corner of the cave: dried meat, water skins, medicine bundles, extra clothing, even books wrapped in oiled leather to protect them from moisture. "This place has been shelter for my people for many generations," Tenebah said without looking up from his work. "We cache supplies here for those who might need them, hunters caught by storms, families fleeing danger, warriors returning from raids. The white man calls it stealing, but we call it staying alive." He moved to check on Will, placing a weathered hand against the boy's forehead with surprising gentleness. "Bad fever. But I have seen worse. In my people, we say a child's spirit burns bright to fight off sickness. But sometimes it burns too bright and threatens to consume itself." Ruth felt tears she'd been holding back since they fled Fort Briar finally start to flow. "Can you help him?" "I can try. But it will take time, and we may not have much of that." Tenebah's dark eyes met hers across the fire. "Those men following us, they will not give up easily. When the storm passes, they will come." The words hit Ruth like cold water, despite the growing warmth of the cave. She'd been so focused on immediate survival that she'd almost forgotten about the hunters behind them, and the men with badges and guns who'd branded her a murderer and her son a burden to be eliminated. "How much time do we have?" "Storm will blow itself out by morning, maybe sooner. After that." Tenebah shrugged eloquently. "Depends how badly they want us dead, and how well they can track in snow." Ruth sank down beside Will's makeshift bed, feeling the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Stay here, and Will might recover from his fever, but their enemies would find them trapped and defenseless. Leave now, and the journey might kill her son before they found other shelter. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why risk your life for strangers? You don't know us. You don't owe us anything." Tenebah was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire's dancing flames. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and older vows. "When I was 10 winters old, my uncle was shot by white soldiers near the reservation border. They called it a misunderstanding, said he was gathering herbs in restricted territory, said they thought he was a hostile preparing for war. The bullet shattered his leg, left him bleeding in snow, not much different from what we just escaped. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward like prayers made visible. I ran to the nearest white settlement for help. Not far, maybe 3 miles through country I knew like the back of my hand. I spoke their language well enough to explain what had happened, to beg for a doctor, or at least bandages and medicine to stop the bleeding." Ruth felt her throat tighten with growing understanding. "They laughed at me, called me a lying savage trying to trick them into some kind of ambush. Told me to go back where I belonged and leave civilized folks alone. One man even set his dog on me when I wouldn't leave their porch." Tenebah looked up at her then, and Ruth saw the old anger burning in his dark eyes, like coals that had never quite cooled. "By the time I returned with help from my own people, my uncle was dead. He had bled out alone in the snow while I was being turned away by people who could have saved him with small effort and smaller kindness." "I'm sorry," Ruth whispered. "That day, I made a vow that has shaped every choice since. I would never turn away from a child or parent in need, regardless of their skin color or the danger to myself. I would not let hate make me like those men who watched my uncle die for lack of compassion. Understanding hit Ruth like lightning, illuminating a dark landscape. This wasn't just rescue, it was a form of justice, a way of balancing scales that had been weighted against mercy for too long. "So you're not saving us," she said. "You're keeping a promise to the dead." "Both," Tenebah said simply. "Sometimes they are the same thing." As if summoned by their conversation, Will stirred and opened his eyes. They were clearer than they'd been in days, though he was obviously still weak from his ordeal. "Mama," he whispered, his voice hoarse, but recognizably his own. Ruth was beside him instantly, taking his small hands in hers and feeling the fever beginning to break, like storm clouds, finally releasing their burden. "I'm here, baby. We're safe." Will's gaze moved to Tenebah, who was watching from across the fire with an expression Ruth couldn't quite read. Curiosity mixed with wariness, but no fear. Children, she'd learned, were often better judges of character than their elders. "Are you an Indian?" Will asked with the directness that only children could manage. "I am Dene, what you call Navajo." Will considered this gravely, as if filing away information for future reference. "Did you save us from the storm?" "Yes." "Thank you." The words came out formal and precise, the way Ruth had taught him to speak to adults. "Are you going to help us get away from the bad men?" Tenebah's expression softened slightly. "I will try, young warrior. But it will require courage from all of us." "Can you be brave?" Will straightened his shoulders, as much as his weakness would allow. "Yes, sir. I can be brave. I want to help fight the bad men who hurt my daddy." The innocent declaration hit Ruth like a physical blow. In her efforts to protect Will from the ugliest truths about his father's death, she'd apparently failed to shield him from understanding that Thomas had been murdered rather than killed by accident. Children, it seemed, had their own ways of piecing together truths that adults tried to hide. "Well," she said carefully, "what makes you think someone hurt Daddy?" "I heard things." Will said, his young face serious beyond his years. "Heard you crying at night when you thought I was sleeping. Heard people in town saying mean things about you. And Daddy's friend Abel looked funny when he told me about the accident, like he was telling a lie, but didn't want to." Ruth exchanged a glance with Tenebah, who nodded slightly as if to say, "The boy understands more than you realize." Perhaps it was time to treat Will like a partner in their survival, rather than just someone to be protected. "You're right," she said quietly. "Someone did hurt Daddy. And now they want to hurt us too because they're afraid we might find out who they are. But we're going to stop them." Ruth looked at her son, 8 years old, but carrying himself with a determination that reminded her powerfully of Thomas, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting back. "Yes," she said firmly, "we're going to stop them." As the fire burned higher and Will's fever continued to break, Ruth realized that the inciting incident wasn't just their flight from Fort Briar or even their rescue by Tenebah. It was this moment when 3 strangers bound by circumstance and tragedy decided to become something more than victims. When they chose to trust each other, despite every reason to remain isolated and suspicious. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken its fury spent against the mountains that had weathered countless such tempests. Soon their enemies would come looking armed with righteous anger and legal authority. But when they did, they wouldn't find helpless prey waiting for slaughter. They would find a family forged in fire and ice, united by shared purpose and mutual protection. And that might just be enough to tip the scales of justice back toward truth. But first, they would have to survive the night, and in the morning, they would have to decide whether to keep running or finally make a stand. The cave felt like sanctuary. But Ruth was learning that sanctuary was often just another word for trap. The real test would come when they emerged into daylight and faced the choices that would determine not just their survival, but who they would choose to be when everything else was stripped away. First obstacle dawn came gray and cold to the high country, filtering through the cave entrance like weak tea through muslin. Will's fever had broken completely during the night, leaving him weak but lucid, asking for water and managing small amounts of the jerky and hardtack Tenebah produced from his seemingly endless stores. Ruth had spent the hours before sunrise, watching their protector move through the cave like smoke given form, checking and rechecking their supplies, cleaning weapons she hadn't noticed him carrying, preparing for whatever the day might bring. His efficiency was both comforting and unsettling. This was clearly a man who had lived with danger so long it had become as natural as breathing. Storms ending, Tenebah announced as the wind's howling faded to occasional gusts. By midday, sky will be clear enough for tracking. Ruth felt her stomach drop. Clear sky meant their pursuers could see their trail follow the signs that no amount of wind and snow could completely erase. How much time do we have? Not much. Tenebah moved to the cave entrance, his body tense with the alertness of a predator scenting danger. And there is something else. Yesterday when I went to check our back trail, I saw riders. 5 men, maybe 6, moving this direction before the storm grew too heavy. You think they followed us? I think they know these mountains better than we might hope. His expression was grim. One of them rides like a hunter, someone who knows how to read sign even in bad weather. They stopped when snow grew thick, but they will resume tracking once visibility improves. Ruth joined him at the cave entrance, squinting out at the gradually clearing landscape. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles away, she could see thin columns of smoke rising from what might be a sheltered campsite. Their enemies had spent the night closer than she dared imagine. "We can't stay here," she said. No. This cave is known to some of the white trappers who work these mountains. If they know of it eventually, someone will think to look here. But Will's still weak from the fever, traveling in this cold when he's barely recovered. Risk of staying is greater than risk of moving, Tenebah said simply. Here we are trapped like rabbits in a den. Moving, we at least have the chance to choose our ground. Ruth looked back at Will, who was listening to their conversation with the grave attention children brought to adult discussions that might determine their fate. He was pale and thin from his illness, but his eyes were clear and alert. "What do you think, baby?" she asked. "Can you travel today if we need to?" Will pushed himself up on his elbows, a gesture that clearly cost him effort, but which he managed without complaint. "I can ride, Mama. If Tenebah thinks we should go, then we should go." The simple trust in his voice made Ruth's heart clench. This 8-year-old boy was placing his life in the hands of a man they'd known for less than a day, in circumstances that would terrify most adults. But somehow, his faith felt justified. Tenebah had proven himself worthy of trust through actions rather than words. "There is a place," Tenebah said slowly, as if weighing options that all carried deadly risks. Old trading post, maybe 8 miles south along the ridge line, built strong with stone walls and good sight lines. Abandoned now, but defensible if we could reach it. Defensible. Ruth felt ice forming in her chest. "You mean we'd make a stand there, fight them, only if cornered? Better to discourage pursuit than invite direct confrontation. But if fighting becomes necessary..." Tenebah's hand moved unconsciously to the knife at his belt. Stone walls are better than cave walls for that purpose. The casual way he discussed potential violence should have terrified Ruth, but instead, she found it oddly comforting. This was a man who understood that sometimes survival required more than just running and hiding. Sometimes it required being willing to hurt people who were trying to hurt you. How long would it take us to reach this trading post? In good weather with healthy horses, perhaps 4 hours. With current conditions and the boy's weakness. Tenebah shrugged. Most of the day. And we would be exposed during travel, vulnerable to attack from riders with rifles. Ruth weighed their options, none of which seemed to offer much hope. Stay in the cave and wait for their enemies to find them trapped. Leave now and risk Will's health, their own exhaustion, and potential ambush during the journey. Try to lose their pursuers in the wilderness and probably freeze to death when night fell again. Mama, Will said quietly, "What would Daddy want us to do?" The question hit Ruth like a revelation. Thomas had always been practical about danger, always willing to take calculated risks rather than wait for problems to solve themselves. He would have said that motion was better than stagnation, that choosing your own ground was better than letting enemies choose it for you. He'd want us to fight, she said with sudden certainty. Not run forever, but find a place where we could make a stand and force them to face the consequences of their lies. Tenebah nodded approvingly. Your husband was a wise man. You didn't know him. I know he raised a son with courage and married a woman willing to risk everything for truth. That tells me what kind of man he was. As they prepared to leave the cave, gathering supplies, checking weapons, steeling themselves for the journey ahead, Ruth realized that their first real obstacle wasn't just Will's lingering weakness or the pursuing riders. It was the choice between remaining victims and becoming something more dangerous. They were about to find out whether that choice would save them or damn them all. But either way, they would face their fate as a family united by more than blood, bound together by shared purpose, mutual protection, and the understanding that some things were worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossible. The cave had been sanctuary, but sanctuary was a luxury they could no longer afford. Outside, their enemies were breaking camp and preparing to resume the hunt. It was time to see whether the hunted could become the hunters, whether justice could triumph over corruption, whether three people with nothing left to lose could stand against the combined weight of legal authority and organized hatred. Tenebah helped Will onto his horse, while Ruth checked her weapons one final time. Thomas's old shotgun and the handful of shells that might be all that stood between them and death. Not much to bet their lives on, but it would have to be enough. The trading post lay somewhere ahead in the snow-covered wilderness, offering the possibility of defensible ground and a final confrontation with the truth. Behind them, the smoke from their enemies' campfires was already beginning to move, signaling the resumption of pursuit. The first obstacle was behind them now. They had chosen motion over stagnation, action over acceptance, the slim hope of victory over the certainty of defeat. What came next would test whether that choice had been wisdom or fatal folly. Rising action. The abandoned trading post squatted against Devil's Tooth Ridge like a broken monument to failed dreams, its stone walls blackened by weather and time, but still solid enough to stop bullets. The structure had been built by some long-dead optimist who'd believed civilization could take root even in country that seemed designed to kill anything soft or trusting. They'd pushed hard through the morning, Will riding doubled with Tenebah, while Ruth followed on foot, her legs burning with exhaustion, but her mind sharp with purpose. Behind them, always behind them, came the distant shapes of pursuit. 5 riders maintaining steady pressure, never quite catching up, but never falling far enough behind to offer real hope of escape. "Fell good position," Tenebah said as they approached the trading post, his warrior's eye automatically assessing the tactical advantages. Single approach route, clear fields of fire, thick walls. If we must make a stand, this is where we do it. Ruth nodded grimly, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The building looked defensible enough, but 5 armed men against their pathetic collection of weapons still seemed like impossible odds. Worse, she could see dust clouds on their back trail. Their pursuers had gained ground during the last mile, probably sensing that their quarry was finally running out of places to run. As they settled into the abandoned building, Ruth tried not to think about how exposed they were despite the stone walls. The empty windows made them sitting targets, and their ammunition was painfully limited. Tenebah's Winchester rifle and Colt revolver, her own shotgun with 6 shells, and Will clutching Thomas's old Navy Colt that was almost too heavy for his small hands. "Mama," Will said quietly as she arranged their meager supplies. "Who are those men really? Why do they want to hurt us so bad?" Ruth paused in her work, unsure how to explain the web of corruption and murder that had destroyed their lives. How could she make a child understand that sometimes people in authority use their power to hide crimes rather than punish them? "Remember how we talked about bullies at school?" she said finally. "How sometimes they pick on smaller kids to make themselves feel important?" Will nodded gravely. "Well, some grown-ups are bullies too. But instead of just taking lunch money, they take lives. And when someone tries to stop them, they use their power to make that person look like the bad one. Like they did to Daddy." Ruth felt tears threaten at the simple, devastating accuracy of the observation. "Yes, baby. Like they did to Daddy." Tenebah, who had been checking their weapons and sight lines, looked up from his work. "In my tribe, we have a story about Coyote and Eagle. Coyote was jealous of Eagle's strength and beauty, so he told all the other animals that Eagle was dangerous, would steal their young. Soon all the animals believed Coyote's lies and drove Eagle from the valley." Will listened with the intense attention children gave to stories that contained hidden truths. "What happened to Eagle?" She found a new valley where the animals were wiser and could tell truth from lies. But the old valley suffered without her protection, and Coyote's lies eventually poisoned even him when real danger came. No one believed his warnings because they had learned he was not to be trusted. It was a children's tale, but Ruth heard the deeper message. Sometimes escape was the only option, but eventually truth had a way of surfacing, and lies had a way of destroying those who told them. As darkness began to fall, they took turns keeping watch. Ruth drew first shift, peering through gaps in the stone wall toward the trail they'd followed. At first, she saw nothing but deepening shadows, and the last light reflecting off snow. But then, movement caught her eye riders approaching slowly but steadily, their horses picking careful paths through the rocky ground. "They're here," she whispered to Tenebah. He joined her at the window, moving with that ghostly silence she'd come to associate with him. Together, they watched 5 figures deploy around the trading post with military precision, spreading out to cover all possible escape routes. "Professional," Tenebah observed grimly. "This is not their first hunt." "Can you see Jed?" Center positioned the big man on the bay horse. And there, Tenebah's voice took on a harder edge. "I know that one. Abel Pike, your husband's mining partner." Ruth felt bile rise in her throat. Abel Pike, who'd found Thomas's body, who'd wept at the funeral, who'd been spreading whispers about her character ever since. What was he doing riding with the sheriff's posse unless he was there? She said, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. The night Thomas died, Abel was there. Perhaps he saw more than he admitted. The implication hit Ruth like cold water. If Abel had witnessed Thomas's murder and stayed silent, if he'd helped cover up the crime while spreading lies about the victim's widow, the betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. But there was no time to process the emotional damage. Jed Connor's voice cut through the darkness, carrying clearly across the snow-covered ground. "Ruth Caldwell, I know you're in there." Ruth moved closer to the window, but stayed hidden behind stone. "What do you want Jed?" "To talk about your husband's death, about certain papers he might have hidden before his unfortunate accident." There it was confirmation that Thomas had indeed gathered evidence against someone, and that someone was desperate enough to kill to keep it hidden. But Jed's words also revealed something else. He didn't know where that evidence was. "What papers?" Ruth called back buying time while her mind raced. "Don't play innocent." Thomas was gathering documents, asking questions about supply shipments and territorial funds. He was going to destroy good men's reputations with lies and half-truths. "You mean he was going to expose your stealing?" A pause. Then Jed's laughter echoing off the stone walls, but it carried an edge of desperation that hadn't been there before. Stealing Thomas was the thief, Ruth skimming from the territorial taxes selling supplies meant for the reservation to private buyers. "We have proof documents in his own handwriting." The accusation hit Ruth like a physical blow. Could it be true? Had Thomas been the corrupt one, and Jed the lawman trying to expose him? But even as doubt crept in, she remembered the blood-stained wedding ring hidden in their woodpile. The fear in Thomas's eyes before he died, the note directing her to evidence hidden in the church bell tower. "You're lying," she called out. "Am I?" asked Abel. He worked the claims with Thomas, saw him making deals with freight haulers, splitting profits from supplies that should have gone to the reservation. Abel Pike's voice came shakily across the snow, thick with what sounded like genuine anguish. "I'm sorry, Ruth. I didn't want to believe it either, but the evidence. Thomas was involved in things that got people hurt." Ruth stared into the darkness, feeling her understanding of everything shift like sand beneath her feet. But then she remembered something else, something that cut through the confusion like a blade through fog. Even if that were true, she called out, "It doesn't explain what happened to Ayanna." The silence that followed was different, charged with sudden tension that Ruth could feel, even across the distance separating them. When Jed spoke again, his voice had lost its false reasonableness. "I don't know what lies that savage has been filling your head with, but you're talking about things beyond your understanding. Last chance, Ruth. Come out now, leave the boy and the Indian, and maybe we can work something out." Ruth looked at Tenebah, who had been listening to this exchange with growing intensity. His dark eyes met hers across the shadowy interior of the trading post, and she saw understanding pass between them without words. "He's afraid," Tenebah said quietly. "Whatever happened to Ayanna, he knows we know about it. That makes him desperate." "Who was Ayanna?" Will asked from his position behind the stone wall, his young voice cutting through the adult tension. Tenebah was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the careful precision of someone sharing sacred pain. "My cousin's daughter. She came to your town last winter with her baby, my great-nephew. The child was sick, burning with fever like you were. She begged for medicine, for help." Ruth felt ice forming in her veins as understanding dawned. The town council met, voted to turn her away, claiming they had no supplies to spare for Indians. She and the baby died in the cold 2 days later. The memory hit Ruth like lightning. She remembered that meeting, remembered the discussion about limited resources and setting precedents. Thomas had been there. Thomas had participated in that decision. Your husband was on that council. Tenebah continued, his voice steady, but Ruth could hear the old pain beneath it. "But I have been watching your town since Ayanna died, learning who was responsible. And I discovered something interesting about that vote." "What?" "The official record shows a unanimous decision to deny aid. But I spoke to others who were there, people with guilty consciences who needed to unburden themselves. The real vote was different." Ruth felt her world tilting. "Different how?" "3 council members voted to help Ayanna, including your husband. Only 2 voted to turn her away. But somehow the official minutes recorded a unanimous rejection." The implications crashed over Ruth like an avalanche. If the council records had been falsified, if Thomas had actually voted to help Ayanna, but someone had covered it up. "Jed," she breathed. Jed was town clerk, then responsible for recording the minutes. And as sheriff, he controlled what supplies were available for emergency aid. Tenebah added grimly. Suddenly, everything made horrible sense. Jed hadn't just falsified the council records, he'd been stealing the medical supplies that could have saved Ayanna and her child, selling them for personal profit while letting innocent people die. And when Thomas started investigating the discrepancies, asking questions about missing inventory and altered documents, "He killed my husband to cover up his crimes," Ruth said with absolute certainty. "And now he's here to kill us for the same reason," Tenebah replied. Before Ruth could respond, the night exploded into violence. Rifle fire erupted from multiple positions around the trading post, muzzle flashes lighting the darkness like deadly fireworks as bullets shattered what remained of the windows and sent stone chips flying like shrapnel. Ruth threw herself over Will, pulling him down behind the thickest part of the wall, while Tenebah returned fire with careful measured shots from his Winchester. The siege had begun in earnest, and Ruth knew with terrible certainty that Jed Connors had abandoned any pretense of legal authority. This was pure murder, dressed up in badges and justified by lies. "Stay low," she shouted to Will as another volley of bullets chewed chunks from the stone walls. "Keep your head down no matter what happens." But even as she spoke, Ruth realized that staying defensive would only delay the inevitable. Jed had more men, more ammunition, and the luxury of time. Unless something changed dramatically, they would be ground down through simple attrition. That's when she made a decision that surprised even herself. Checking her shotgun one final time, Ruth prepared to do something that would have been unthinkable just days before. She was going to stop running and start fighting back. The rising action wasn't just about the approaching confrontation or even the revelation about Ayanna's death. It was about the moment when Ruth finally understood the full scope of what she was fighting against. Not just personal hatred or small-town prejudice, but systematic corruption that reached to the very heart of Fort Breyer's power structure. And understanding that she realized that survival wasn't enough anymore. Justice was what mattered now, even if pursuing it meant risking everything they had left. The gunfire outside continued, but Ruth was no longer just trying to survive it. She was planning how to end it once and for all. Midpoint twist. The gunfight raged through the night, like a fever dream made of muzzle flashes and ricocheting bullets. Ruth crouched behind the stone wall with Will pressed against her side, while Tenebah moved between windows like a ghost, his rifle speaking with deadly precision into the darkness. Twice she heard pained curses from their attackers, suggesting his marksmanship was taking its toll. But they were still outnumbered, still trapped, still facing inevitable defeat through simple attrition. Ruth's shotgun had claimed one of Jed's men early in the fight, catching him as he tried to rush the back entrance. Tenebah had wounded at least one other, judging by the blood trail visible in the snow. But ammunition was running low, and their enemies showed no signs of retreating. As dawn broke gray and cold over the high country, the gunfire finally stopped. Ruth could see 4 figures now instead of the original 5, confirming their small victories. But Jed's voice, when it came, carried a confidence that chilled her more than the mountain air. Getting tired in there, Ruth running low on bullets, I'd wager. She didn't respond, conserving both ammunition and energy for whatever came next. Let him wonder about their capabilities and resolve. "I've got something here you might want to see." Jed continued, and Ruth heard the sound of boots crunching through snow growing closer despite the obvious danger. She risked a glance through a gap in the stone wall and felt her heart stop. A 6th figure was stumbling toward the trading post, a man with his hands bound behind his back, being prodded forward by rifle barrels. Blood streaked his face, and his clothes were torn, but Ruth recognized him despite the damage. Danny Morrison. The young man from the general store who'd objected to hunting down a woman and child. Danny. Ruth called out, confusion and horror warring in her voice. "What's he doing here?" Jed appeared beside the bound man, his rifle trained on Danny's head. In the morning light, the sheriff looked older than Ruth remembered his face, haggard with sleepless nights and guilty calculations. "Seems our friend Danny here had some interesting things to say once we caught up with him," Jed announced. "Tell her, boy. Tell her what you told us about the night Thomas died." Danny raised his battered head, and Ruth could see that one eye was swollen completely shut, his lip split and bleeding. When he spoke, his voice was thick with pain and something that might have been relief. "I'm sorry, Ruth," he whispered. "I should have spoken up months ago. Should have told the truth when it might have mattered." "What truth?" Ruth felt ice forming in her chest. "I was there that night. Up in the hills hunting elk when I heard voices arguing down by Thomas's claim. Went to look thinking maybe someone was in trouble." Danny's voice broke. "Saw them arguing about papers, about evidence Thomas said he was going to turn over to the territorial marshal. Ruth gripped Will's hand tighter as understanding began to dawn. Thomas had discovered the supply thefts had documentation proving that medicine and food meant for the reservation was being sold to private buyers instead. But that wasn't the worst of it. Danny swayed on his feet, clearly struggling to remain conscious. He'd also found the real council minutes from the night they voted on helping that Navajo woman. Found proof that the official record was a lie. The revelation hit Ruth like a physical blow. What did the real minutes say? That your husband led the fight to help her. Thomas Doc Peterson and Samuel Wright all voted to provide medicine and supplies. Only Jed and Mayor Hutchins voted against. But somehow, the official record showed a unanimous rejection. Tenebah had gone rigid beside the window, his knuckles white where they gripped his rifle. This was confirmation of what he'd suspected, but never been able to prove that Ayanna's death hadn't been the result of community prejudice, but individual corruption. Thomas knew. Danny continued, his words coming faster, as if he needed to expel them before his strength gave out. Knew that Jed had falsified the records and stolen the supplies that could have saved that woman and her baby. He was going to expose everything, bring federal investigators to look into the missing territorial funds. So Jed killed him for it. Ruth said, pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. I saw the whole thing. Saw Jed hit Thomas with a mining pick when Thomas refused to hand over the evidence. Saw them cave in the mine shaft with him still alive inside. Danny's voice dissolved into sobs. And I was too much of a coward to stop it. Too scared to speak up afterward. The confession shattered Ruth's world and rebuilt it simultaneously. Thomas hadn't been corrupt. He'd been a hero trying to expose corruption. He hadn't voted to let Ayanna die. He'd fought to save her. Every lie told about him, every accusation leveled at Ruth had been designed to cover up the crimes of the man who'd murdered him. But before the full impact could settle, Jed's rifle cracked across the morning air. Danny Morrison pitched forward into the snow, a spreading red stain marking where he fell. Touching story, Jed called out, his voice stripped of all pretense now. Too bad the only witness won't be repeating it to anyone else. Ruth screamed, not in fear, but in rage so pure it surprised her. This young man had finally found the courage to tell the truth, and Jed had murdered him for it, just like he'd murdered Thomas. But even as horror flooded through her, Ruth realized something crucial. In his desperation to silence Danny, Jed had revealed his own weakness. He was terrified of the truth coming out, terrified of what Thomas had discovered. And that terror made him reckless. "You bastard," she screamed. "You murdering bastard." Language, Ruth. Jed called back, false calm returning to his voice. No need for harsh words. Poor Danny there just couldn't keep his mouth shut about things that didn't concern him. Same problem your husband had. But there was something else in Jed's voice now, a note of desperation that hadn't been there before. The midpoint twist wasn't just Danny's revelation about Thomas's innocence. It was the moment when Ruth understood that Jed Connors wasn't just a corrupt sheriff covering his crimes. He was a man backed into a corner, growing more dangerous with each lie that unraveled. "Where are the papers, Ruth?" Jed's voice carried a new edge. "The evidence Thomas gathered before his accident. We know he hid them somewhere." Ruth felt a savage joy as she realized her husband had been cleverer than his killers knew. If Jed was still looking for the evidence, it meant Thomas had successfully hidden it before his death. The truth was still out there, waiting to be found. "Go to hell, Jed," she called back. His laughter carried a note of madness. "You think this is about money, about covering up a few missing supply shipments. You have no idea what you're really threatening. Then tell me." There was a long pause, filled only by the wind whistling through the broken windows. When Jed spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd finally decided to stop pretending. "It wasn't just supplies, Ruth. It was an entire system. territorial contracts, mining rights, federal subsidies for reservation management. Your husband stumbled onto something that goes all the way to the territorial capital, maybe even Washington. People with real power have real investments in keeping certain truths buried. The scope of it staggered Ruth. This wasn't just local corruption, it was a network of graft and murder that reached far beyond Fort Breyer's borders. Thomas hadn't just discovered a petty theft. He'd uncovered evidence of crimes that could topple territorial officials and federal appointees. So you see, Jed continued, this isn't just about protecting my reputation anymore. This is about protecting very important people who don't like to be embarrassed. People who have resources you can't imagine and no compunctions about using them. The midpoint twist crystallized around Ruth like ice forming on a window. They weren't just fighting one corrupt sheriff, they were fighting a system of organized crime that had turned territorial administration into a personal profit center. And that system had unlimited resources to deploy against anyone who threatened it. But the twist also revealed something else. If Thomas's evidence was comprehensive enough to threaten such powerful people, it was also comprehensive enough to destroy them completely. The truth wasn't just about vindicating her husband's memory or clearing her own name anymore. It was about bringing down an entire criminal enterprise that had been masquerading as legitimate government. Ruth checked her shotgun and looked at Tenebah, who had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding. They were no longer just trying to survive long enough to escape their pursuers. They were now the only people standing between a massive conspiracy and its complete success. And that made them infinitely more dangerous, both to their enemies and to themselves. The midpoint twist had changed everything. The question now was whether they were strong enough to carry the weight of truth that Thomas had died trying to expose. Outside, she could hear Jed giving orders to his remaining men, preparing for what he clearly intended to be a final assault. The time for revelation was over. Now came the time for justice, whatever the cost. Second obstacle. The aftermath of Danny Morrison's murder settled over the trading post like a shroud, the young man's blood steaming in the snow as his life ebbed away. Ruth felt something fundamental break inside her chest. Not her spirit, but her last attachment to the illusion that this could end peacefully. Jed Connors had just executed a witness in cold blood, and he would do the same to them without hesitation. He's lost all pretense now. Tenebah observed quietly, checking his ammunition. No more talk of law and order, just murder to cover murder. Ruth nodded grimly, her hands steady despite the rage burning in her chest. She had 3 shells left for the shotgun. Tenebah's Winchester was down to 2 rounds, his Colt to 4. Will crouched behind the stone wall with Thomas's Navy revolver, the weapon almost too heavy for his small hands. But his young face set with determination that broke her heart. "Mama," Will said quietly, "are we going to die here?" The question hit Ruth like a blade between the ribs. Her 8-year-old son was facing the possibility of death with more courage than most grown men could manage. And she owed him honesty rather than false comfort. "I don't know, baby," she said. "But if we do, it won't be for nothing. People will remember that we tried to tell the truth." "Good," Will said simply. Daddy would want people to remember the truth. Before Ruth could respond, Jed's voice cut through the morning air again, closer now, and edged with desperate fury. "Time for games is over, Ruth. You've got 1 minute to come out, or we're coming in to finish this." Ruth looked around their defensive position, assessing their tactical situation with eyes that Thomas had taught to see clearly in crisis. The stone walls would stop rifle bullets, but they wouldn't stop determined men with overwhelming firepower. The windows provided good fields of fire, but they also made the defenders vulnerable to return shots. Most critically, they had only one way out, and that way was covered by hostile guns. There might be another option. Tenebah said suddenly, his dark eyes focused on something beyond the main battle. "What option?" "The back wall, where the traitor built his escape tunnel." Ruth stared at him. Escape tunnel. Old trading posts on hostile frontier always had them. Hidden passage leading to concealed exit maybe 100 yards from main building in case of Indian attack. His mouth quirked in bitter irony. Seems appropriate that we might use it to escape white men. Ruth felt a spark of hope flare in her chest. You're sure it exists? No. But if it does, it would be behind that pile of crates in the back corner. Traders always disguised tunnel entrances as storage areas. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation was all they had left. Ruth looked at Will, seeing her own determination reflected in his young face. What do you think, baby, want to try being explorers? Will managed a weak smile. Like in the adventure books Daddy used to read me. Exactly like that. They moved quickly but quietly toward the back of the trading post, while Tenebah maintained watch at the front windows. Ruth's heart hammered as she and Will began shifting crates and barrels, searching for any sign of hidden construction. Then Will's small hand found something that made him gasp. Mama, there's a handle here. Ruth knelt beside him and felt along the base of the wall until her fingers closed on an iron ring set flush with the stone. When she pulled a section of the wall, swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness. Found it, she called softly to Tenebah. But before he could respond, the front wall of the trading post exploded inward. Jed and his remaining men had decided that patience was a luxury they could no longer afford. The final assault had begun. Ruth grabbed Will and dove toward the tunnel entrance as bullets filled the air where they'd been standing. Behind them, she could hear Tenebah's rifle answering the attack, buying them precious seconds with deadly precision. Go, he shouted. Take the boy and run. Not without you. Ruth called back, torn between escape and loyalty. Someone must survive to tell the truth, Canal. Another volley of gunfire raked the trading post, and Ruth saw Tenebah stagger as a bullet creased his shoulder. Blood flowed down his arm, but he kept fighting his colt, barking defiance at their attackers. Ruth made the hardest decision of her life. Grabbing Will's hand, she plunged into the tunnel, pulling her son behind her into the suffocating darkness. The passage was barely wide enough for an adult, carved roughly from the living rock and supported by rotting timber that groaned ominously as they crawled through. Behind them, the gunfight continued with desperate intensity. She could hear Tenebah's weapons still speaking, but the return fire was overwhelming. How long could one man hold off 4 attackers, no matter how skilled? The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, a claustrophobic nightmare of stone and darkness. Will whimpered once as his knee struck a sharp rock, but he didn't cry out or complain. The boy was showing courage that humbled his mother, facing the unknown with the same determination his father had shown. Then suddenly, they emerged into daylight. The tunnel's exit was concealed behind a cluster of boulders, perhaps 100 yards from the trading post, invisible from the main building, but offering a clear view of the battle raging there. Ruth peered around the rocks and felt her heart sink. She could see Jed and 3 other men advancing on the trading post from multiple angles, their rifles trained on every window and doorway. Tenebah was still fighting, but he was trapped now, surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned. We have to help him, Will said, echoing her own thoughts. Ruth looked at her son, then at the shotgun in her hands. 3 shells against 4 armed men. The mathematics of survival were brutally clear. But sometimes she realized mathematics wasn't everything. Sometimes courage and determination could tip scales that logic said were immovable. Stay here, she told Will. Stay hidden and don't come out no matter what happens. Mama, no. Listen to me. Ruth gripped Will's shoulders, looking directly into his eyes. If something happens to me, you wait until dark, then you head south toward Denver. Find your daddy's cousin. Tell him everything we learned here. Make sure the truth doesn't die with us. Will's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded bravely. I will, Mama, I promise. Ruth kissed his forehead, then turned toward the trading post where Tenebah was making his last stand. The second obstacle wasn't just the overwhelming firepower arrayed against them or even the desperate tactical situation. It was the choice between certain safety through abandonment and probable death through loyalty, between saving herself and her son by letting a good man die alone, or risking everything to stand with someone who had already sacrificed so much for them. Ruth Caldwell had spent months running from fights she couldn't win. But this fight was different. This fight was about who she would choose to be when everything else was stripped away. Checking her shotgun one final time, she began moving toward the trading post, using the scattered boulders for cover. Behind her, Will watched with eyes that held far too much understanding for his age. The second obstacle was about to become a test of everything she'd learned about courage sacrifice, and the price of standing for truth in a world that often rewarded lies. Whether she would pass that test remained to be seen. But she was finally ready to find out. Climax Ruth moved through the boulder field like a ghost seeking vengeance, her shotgun ready, and her heart hammering against her ribs. Ahead, the trading post had fallen ominously quiet. No more gunfire from within, though she could still hear Jed and his men calling to each other as they prepared to storm the building. A lantern had been overturned during the fight, its oil spreading across the wooden floor and catching fire. Smoke was beginning to pour from the broken windows, adding urgency to an already desperate situation. If Tenebah was still alive inside, he wouldn't be for long. Ruth reached the back wall of the trading post just as she heard Jed's voice from the front entrance. "Burn him out, boys. No point taking chances with a wounded savage." The casual cruelty of the words filled Ruth with rage so pure it surprised her. She circled toward the side of the building, using the smoke as cover, and peered around the corner. What she saw made her blood run cold. Tenebah was pressed against an interior wall, clutching his wounded shoulder while blood seeped between his fingers. His weapons lay empty beside him, and flames were beginning to lick at the wooden supports above his head. He was trapped, wounded, defenseless, and Jed Connors was advancing through the smoke with a rifle aimed at his chest. "Should have minded your own business, Indian." Jed said, his voice carrying clearly through the crackling flames. "Should have stayed on your reservation where you belong." That's when Ruth made her move. Her shotgun boomed like thunder in the confined space, the blast catching one of Jed's men square in the back and dropping him instantly. The remaining gunmen spun toward this new threat, giving Tenebah the distraction he needed to roll away from the spreading fire. "Ruth." Jed's voice was incredulous. "How the hell?" His question was cut off as part of the burning roof collapsed, sending flaming timber crashing down between them. The trading post was becoming an inferno, filling with smoke that made breathing nearly impossible, and heat that promised to cook them all if they didn't get out soon. But Ruth wasn't leaving without Tenebah. She dove through the flames toward where she'd last seen him, her dress smoking from the heat, her lungs burning with each breath. She found him trying to crawl toward the rear exit, his strength fading fast from blood loss and smoke inhalation. "Can you walk?" she shouted over the roar of flames. "With help," he gasped. Ruth got her shoulder under his arm and helped him to his feet. But even as they started toward the back exit, Abel Pike appeared through the smoke with his rifle raised. His face was streaked with soot and twisted with something that might have been madness. "You ruined everything," he screamed at Ruth. "Thomas was supposed to keep quiet. You were supposed to disappear. Now it's all falling apart." The rifle swung toward them, and Ruth knew they were both dead. But then, a small figure materialized behind Abel like an avenging angel, Will, clutching his father's Navy Colt in both hands. "Leave my mama alone," the boy shouted, and the heavy revolver bucked in his grip. The bullet took Abel in the leg, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying. But even as he fell, another section of roof collapsed, trapping them all in the burning building with walls of flame and no clear way out. That's when Jed Connors emerged from the smoke like a demon born from fire. His clothes singed and his face blackened, but his rifle still steady in his hands. Behind him came his last remaining man, both of them moving with the desperate determination of people who knew they were out of options. "End of the line, Ruth," Jed snarled. "No more running, no more hiding. Just you, me, and the truth about what really happened to your husband." Ruth faced him across the burning trading post, her last shotgun shell chambered and ready, Will pressed against her side with the smoking revolver in his small hands. Between them, Tenebah struggled to remain conscious, his dark eyes fixed on something beyond the immediate danger. "You want the truth?" Ruth said, her voice steady despite the heat and smoke. "Here's the truth. You murdered my husband because he discovered you were stealing supplies meant for dying people. You falsified council records to cover up your crimes. You let Ayanna and her baby die so you could profit from their suffering." "Prove it," Jed sneered. "Where are these mysterious papers everyone keeps talking about? Where's your precious evidence?" Ruth smiled, feeling something like peace settle over her, despite the flames closing in on all sides. "You really want to know?" She reached into her dress and pulled out a folded document that had been pressed against her heart since they'd fled Fort Briar, the blood-stained note Thomas had left with his wedding ring, the one she'd thought was too damaged to read completely. "I found this the morning after Thomas's funeral," she said, unfolding the paper carefully. "Thought it was just a goodbye note. But there was more writing on the back, hidden by bloodstains that came clean when I finally worked up the courage to wash them away." Jed's eyes went wide with sudden understanding and fear. Ruth read aloud in a clear voice that carried over the crackling flames. "Evidence of supply theft and council falsification hidden in Church Bell Tower. Copies also sent to territorial marshal and federal authorities in Denver. If something happens to me, this letter should reach them within the week." The effect on Jed was immediate and devastating. His face went white beneath the soot, and the rifle wavered in his hands. "That's impossible," he whispered. "We checked the mail, intercepted everything. Thomas was smarter than you gave him credit for." Ruth continued. "He didn't trust the local mail system. Sent his evidence with a traveling preacher who promised to deliver it personally to the authorities in Denver. It was a complete lie improvised from desperation and delivered with conviction born of righteous fury. But the effect on Jed was everything Ruth had hoped for. He staggered backward as if physically struck his rifle, dropping to point at the floor. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Tell me, Jed. When was the last time you heard from your contacts in the territorial capital? When was the last time you received reassurance that your crimes were still safely hidden?" The truth was, Ruth had no idea whether Thomas had actually sent evidence to anyone, but she could see from Jed's expression that her bluff was working, that guilty paranoia was doing more damage than any bullet could inflict. But even as victory seemed within reach, disaster struck. The weakened floor beneath Abel Pike finally gave way, sending the wounded man crashing through to the trading post's stone foundation below. His terrified screams echoed up through the smoke as flames began to follow him down into what had become a death trap. The collapse destabilized the entire structure. Burning beams groaned and shifted overhead, promising an imminent total collapse that would crush everyone still inside. They had perhaps minutes before the building became their tomb. "Oh, we need to get out now," Tenebah shouted, struggling to his feet despite his wounds. But Jed wasn't finished. Faced with the destruction of everything he'd built through crime and corruption, he raised his rifle one final time with the desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. "If I'm going down," he snarled, "I'm taking all of you with me." The rifle swung toward Will, and Ruth knew with crystal clarity that her son was about to die. Time seemed to slow as she watched Jed's finger tighten on the trigger, as she realized her shotgun was pointed the wrong direction. As she understood that all her courage and determination would come to nothing in the face of one man's evil desperation. That's when Tenebah moved. Despite his wounds, despite his exhaustion, the Navajo warrior lunged forward with the fluid grace of someone trained in combat since childhood. His hand closed on the ancient knife at his belt, and the same blade Ruth had watched him use to prepare their meals. And it found its mark between Jed Connor's ribs with the precision of justice, finally delivered. Jed's eyes went wide with shock and pain. He looked down at the knife protruding from his chest, then back up at Tenebah's impassive face. "You're just a savage." He gasped, blood frothing at his lips. "Yes," Tenebah agreed quietly. "But I am a savage who keeps his promises to the dead." Jed collapsed to his knees, then toppled forward onto his face. The corrupt sheriff of Fort Bryer was finally dead, but his death had come almost too late. Around them, the trading post was disintegrating into a furnace that threatened to consume them all. Flames roared up through the hole where Abel had fallen, while burning debris rained down from the collapsing roof above. "This way," Ruth shouted, grabbing Will with one hand and helping support Tenebah with the other. The tunnel? They stumbled through smoke so thick, it was like moving through liquid darkness, guided more by memory than sight, toward the hidden entrance they discovered earlier. Behind them, the last of Jed's men was screaming as flames cut off his escape route. But there was nothing they could do to help him now. Ruth reached the tunnel entrance first, pushing Will ahead of her into the narrow passage. Then she turned back for Tenebah, who was moving slowly but steadily despite his wounds. "Can you make it?" she asked. "For Ayanna," he said simply. "For your husband. For the truth. Yes, I can make it." As they crawled through the tunnel with flames roaring behind them and safety uncertain ahead, Ruth realized that the climax hadn't just been about surviving Jed's final assault or even exposing his crimes. It had been about choosing who they would be in the moments that mattered most. Cowards or heroes' victims, or fighters, people who abandoned their principles when tested, or people who held to them regardless of the cost. They emerged from the tunnel just as the trading post collapsed completely, sending sparks and burning debris high into the morning sky. In the distance, Ruth could see smoke rising from what had been their battleground, marking the funeral pyre of corruption and the birthplace of something that might eventually become justice. They had survived. All three of them had survived. But the real test would come next, proving that their survival had been worth the price they'd all paid to achieve it. Falling action. The three of them sat in the snow outside the collapsed trading post, watching smoke rise like prayers into the clear mountain air. Tenebah's shoulder wound had stopped bleeding, though he would need proper medical attention soon. Will pressed close to his mother's side, the events of the morning having aged him in ways that broke Ruth's heart. And Ruth herself felt hollowed out as if the fire had burned away, not just the building, but some essential part of her former self. "What happens now?" Will asked quietly, his young voice carrying exhaustion that no child should ever feel. Ruth looked at the smoking ruins where Jed Connors had met his end, then at the vast wilderness surrounding them. They were still miles from Fort Bryer, still carrying the weight of accusations and suspicion, still three people whose word might not be enough to overturn months of lies and misdirection. "Now we go home," she said finally, "and we tell the truth until someone listens." "Will they believe us?" Will persisted. Tenebah, who had been cleaning his knife with methodical precision, looked up from his work. Truth has its own power. Lies need constant tending like fires that die without fuel. But truth burns on its own, grows stronger with time rather than weaker. Ruth hoped he was right, but she also understood that they would need more than hope to convince Fort Bryer that their trusted sheriff had been a murderer and thief. They would need evidence witnesses some way to corroborate the story they'd lived through. As if reading her thoughts, Tenebah reached into his coat and pulled out a leather portfolio that Ruth recognized with shock. "Jed's papers," he explained. "Took them from his body before the fire could destroy them. Records of supply diversions, falsified documents, correspondence with territorial officials. Everything we need to prove what he was doing." Ruth stared at the portfolio with something approaching awe. "You thought to grab those during the fire. Evidence must survive for justice to be possible," Tenebah said simply. "Without proof, we are just three people with an incredible story that no one will believe." The journey back to Fort Bryer, took 2 days through snow that had begun falling again, though less heavily than the storm that had first brought them together. They traveled slowly, partly because of Tenebah's wound and Will's lingering weakness, but also because Ruth needed time to prepare for what awaited them. Word of their return preceded them. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, a crowd had gathered along the main street. Merchants, laborers, housewives, children all staring in amazement at the sight of Ruth Caldwell returning with the sheriff's horse, but without the sheriff himself. "Where's Jed?" someone called out. "Dead," Ruth replied simply. "Killed trying to murder witnesses to his crimes." The crowd stirred uneasily at this pronouncement. These were people who had trusted Jed Connors, who had believed his version of events, who had turned against Ruth based on his accusations. Learning that their faith had been misplaced would not be easy for them to accept. Ruth could see the skepticism in their faces, the reluctance to believe that they had been so thoroughly deceived. But she could also see something else, a growing awareness that questions they had suppressed were finally demanding answers. Marshal William Hayes was waiting for them at the jail, having arrived in Fort Bryer 3 days earlier as part of his investigation into territorial supply irregularities. Ruth had never been so grateful to see a badge in her life, knowing that here was someone who might actually listen to their story with an open mind. "Mrs. Caldwell," the marshal said as they dismounted, "I have to say, when I heard reports of gunfire and smoke up in the mountains, I wasn't expecting to see you riding back into town." "Now, Marshal, we have evidence," Ruth said without preamble. "Evidence of corruption, murder, and systematic theft that goes all the way to the territorial capital." Hayes examined the portfolio Tenebah handed him, his expression growing grimmer with each document he reviewed. Jed's papers told a story of breathtaking corruption supply contracts fulfilled with substandard goods. While the quality materials were sold privately, territorial funds diverted to personal accounts, federal subsidies for reservation management pocketed, while the intended recipients went without necessities. "Jesus Christ," the marshal breathed. "This is enough to bring down half the territorial administration. And to clear my husband's name," Ruth added quietly. Hayes nodded gravely. "Your husband was a good man who died trying to expose these crimes. He'll be remembered as a hero, Mrs. Caldwell. You have my word on that." The formal proceedings took weeks to complete, but the outcome was never really in doubt once Jed's papers came to light. Federal investigators descended on Fort Bryer like locusts, interviewing witnesses, examining records, tracing the network of corruption that had operated under cover of legitimate government. Abel Pike, who had survived the trading post fire with severe burns and a shattered leg, provided detailed testimony about Jed's criminal organization in exchange for leniency. His confession corroborated everything Ruth and Tenebah had claimed, finally giving the townspeople an authoritative account of what had really happened to Thomas Caldwell. But perhaps the most important moment came when the territorial governor himself arrived in Fort Bryer to oversee the investigation. Standing on the steps of the church where Thomas had once served on the council, the governor issued a public statement that vindicated both the dead and the living. "Thomas Caldwell died a hero," he declared to the assembled crowd. "He gave his life trying to expose corruption and protect the innocent. His widow has been grievously wronged by false accusations, and his memory will be honored throughout this territory." Ruth stood in the crowd, holding Will's hand, listening to words she had never dared hope to hear. Around them, the faces of Fort Bryer's citizens reflected shame, relief, and growing understanding of how completely they had been manipulated. Elizabeth Morrison, Danny's sister, approached Ruth after the governor's speech with tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "We should have listened when Danny tried to tell us the truth. We should have stood up for you instead of believing Jed's lies." Ruth took the young woman's hands in hers, feeling the weight of months of anger and resentment beginning to lift. Fear makes people do things they regret later. What matters is that you're listening now, As the weeks passed and Fort Bryer began the slow process of healing from the wounds Jed's corruption had inflicted, Ruth found herself facing an unexpected choice. The territorial government offered her a position as Indian agent for the region, a role that would involve facilitating better relations between white settlers and the Navajo people, ensuring that supplies reached their intended recipients, and preventing tragedies like Ayana's death from ever happening again. It was meaningful work, important work. But it would mean staying in Fort Bryer, building bridges in a community that had shown itself capable of terrible cruelty. "What do you think?" she asked Tenebah as they sat by the fire in the small cabin the territorial government had provided for them. Will was asleep in the next room, finally able to rest, without fear, for the first time in months. Tenebah was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "I think sometimes the hardest ground is the best place to plant new seeds. If they take root in difficult soil, they will be strong enough to grow anywhere." Ruth nodded understanding. The falling action wasn't just about resolving the immediate crisis, it was about choosing what kind of future they wanted to build from the ashes of the past. And sometimes that meant staying to do the hard work of reconciliation rather than leaving to find easier ground elsewhere. Outside, snow continued to fall on Fort Bryer, covering the old scars and preparing the earth for whatever would grow when spring finally came. Ruth had learned that truth was more resilient than lies, that justice was more powerful than corruption, and that families could be built on choice and courage rather than just blood and circumstance. The falling action was complete. Now came the harder work of rebuilding, reconciling, and learning to live with the consequences of the choices they had all made. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Ruth felt equal to that challenge. She had allies now, people who believed in the possibility of something better. And sometimes that was enough to make even the hardest ground fertile. Resolution and final surprise. 6 months later, Ruth stood in the doorway of the clinic she had helped establish on the edge of Fort Bryer, watching Tenebah teach Will and 3 other local children how to identify medicinal plants along the creek bank. The spring thaw had come early that year, melting away the last remnants of the snow that had nearly killed them during their darkest hour. Her work as Indian agent had proven both more challenging and more rewarding than she had expected. The position required her to navigate complex relationships between white settlers and Navajo families, mediating disputes over land use, water rights, and trade agreements. But it also gave her the opportunity to ensure that supplies reached their intended recipients, and that no one would die from neglect while others profited from their suffering. The clinic had been her own initiative, a place where both white and Navajo families could receive medical care without regard to their ancestry or ability to pay. It hadn't been easy to establish. Many in Fort Bryer had initially resisted the idea of treating Indians alongside white patients. But gradually, as people saw the practical benefits of having skilled healers available to everyone, resistance had given way to grudging acceptance and then genuine cooperation. "Mrs. Caldwell," a voice called from behind her. Ruth turned to see Maria Santos, a young Navajo woman who served as the clinic's translator and herbalist. In her arms was her infant nephew, born healthy and strong 2 weeks earlier, a living symbol of the changes that had taken root in Fort Bryer's rocky soil. "The supply wagon from Denver just arrived," Maria said. "Should I help with the inventory?" "Please," Ruth said, stepping aside to let Maria enter. "And thank you for staying late today. I know your family expects you home for supper." Maria smiled, adjusting the baby in her arms. "This work matters more than convenience. Besides, little Joseph here seems to enjoy watching the medicine sorting." As Maria disappeared into the clinic, Ruth felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The child in Maria's arms represented something precious, a generation that would grow up in a world where help was available, regardless of skin color or tribal affiliation, where corruption was exposed rather than covered up, where truth was valued over expedience. The sound of laughter drew her attention back to the creek, where Will was demonstrating something he'd learned from Tenebah to the other children. At 9 years old, her son had grown tall and confident, his earlier frailty replaced by the resilience that came from surviving real danger and emerging stronger. He spoke both English and Navajo fluently, now moving easily between both worlds, with the unconscious grace of childhood. "The mama," Will called out, spotting her in the doorway. "Tenebah says if we're quiet enough, we might see the deer family that drinks here at sunset." Ruth waved back, her heart full. Will had taken to calling Tenebah father some months ago, a development that had filled her with complex emotions. Thomas would always be Will's biological father, but Tenebah had become something equally important, the man who'd saved them, protected them, and helped them build a new life from the ashes of tragedy. As for her own relationship with Tenebah, it had evolved slowly from gratitude to friendship, to something deeper and more enduring. They'd married in a simple ceremony just after Christmas, with Will standing proudly between them and families from both communities in attendance. It wasn't the passionate romance she'd shared with Thomas, but it was something steadier, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose and love that had been tested by fire. "Ruth." Tenebah's voice came from behind her, warm with affection. She turned to find him approaching, his hands dusty from the plant-gathering lesson, but his eyes bright with news. Marshal Hayes sent word from the territorial capital. "The federal investigation has been completed." Ruth felt her pulse quicken. The corruption network Thomas had died trying to expose had proven even more extensive than anyone had imagined, reaching into territorial offices, federal agencies, and private companies throughout the region. And 17 federal indictments, including 3 territorial officials and a congressman. The supply theft conspiracy has been completely dismantled. Tenebah's expression grew solemn. "Justice has been served, though it came too late for some." Ruth nodded, thinking of Ayanna and her baby, of Danny Morrison, of all the innocent people who had died while corrupt officials profited from their suffering. The victory felt incomplete without them there to see it, but their memory had been honored by the changes their deaths had ultimately brought about. "There's something else?" Tenebah continued, reaching into his coat. This came with the marshal's message. He handed her an official-looking envelope bearing both the territorial seal and federal markings. Ruth opened it carefully and found herself looking at a formal commendation from the territorial governor, recognizing her service as Indian agent and officially establishing the Fort Bryer Clinic as a model for similar facilities throughout the territory. But it was the personal note attached that moved her most deeply. "Mrs. Caldwell, your husband's sacrifice and your courage in exposing his killers have not been forgotten. The Thomas Caldwell Memorial Fund has been established to ensure that medical supplies reach all the people of this territory, regardless of their heritage. Future generations will benefit from his integrity and your determination to see justice done. With highest respect, Governor Samuel Crawford." Ruth felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally start to flow, but they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. Thomas's name would be remembered not for the false accusations that had driven her from town, but for the heroic efforts he'd made to protect the innocent and expose corruption. "Will would be proud," Tenebah said quietly, understanding her emotion. "Yes," Ruth agreed, "he would." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the creek, where Will and his friends were still learning to read the signs of the natural world, Ruth reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. They'd started as strangers thrown together by desperation and storm. But they'd become something more, a family bound. Not by blood alone, but by choice, struggle, and shared commitment to building something better from the ruins of the past. That's when the final surprise arrived. A rider approached from the direction of town, a young woman Ruth recognized as Sarah Mitchell, one of the newer settlers who'd arrived since the corruption scandal had been resolved. "Mrs. Caldwell," Sarah called out as she dismounted. "I've been looking everywhere for you. There's wonderful news from back east." Ruth felt her stomach tighten with familiar apprehension. In her experience, unexpected news rarely brought good tidings. What kind of news? Sarah smiled broadly. About Thomas's family in Pennsylvania, the relatives you never knew existed. They read about the federal investigation in the Eastern newspapers and realized Thomas Caldwell was their lost cousin. They've been searching for you and Will for months. The young woman handed her a thick envelope bearing a Philadelphia postmark. Ruth opened it with trembling hands and found herself reading words that made her heart soar. Dear Mrs. Caldwell, we are writing to extend an invitation that is long overdue. We should have reached out after Thomas's death, but we lost contact with his branch of the family years ago and didn't learn of his passing until we read about the federal investigation in the Philadelphia Inquirer. We understand you have a son, our cousin's boy, and we would very much like to meet him. Our family has resources that could help with his education, and you would always have a place at our table if you ever wished to visit the East. Please know that you have family who care about you. Yours in fellowship, Robert and Margaret Caldwell. Ruth looked up from the letter to find Tenebah and Will both watching her expectantly. What is it, Mama? Will asked. Family. Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion. Family we didn't know we had. Will's eyes brightened with curiosity. Does that mean we have more relatives, people who knew Daddy? It does indeed, and they want to meet you very much. Ruth folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pocket. The invitation represented new possibilities, new connections to Thomas's memory and Will's heritage. But she wasn't ready to leave Fort Bryer yet. There was still too much work to be done here, too many bridges to build, too many lives to touch and heal. But someday, when the clinic was fully established and the relationships between the communities were strong enough to survive without constant mediation, perhaps they would take that journey. Perhaps Will would learn about his father's family and the wider world beyond these mountain valleys. As they walked home together, Ruth and Tenebah side by side, Will chattering excitedly about deer tracks and distant relatives, Ruth felt a profound sense of completeness. Not the false contentment of a life without conflict, but the deeper satisfaction that came from facing hardship and emerging stronger. They'd lost much in the struggle that had brought them together, Thomas, their old life in Fort Bryer, their innocence about the capacity for evil in ordinary people. But they'd gained something precious, too, the knowledge that truth could survive lies, that justice could prevail over corruption, that families could be made as well as born. The sun set behind them as they reached their small house on the edge of town, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded Ruth of the fire that had purged Fort Bryer of its corruption. In the distance, smoke rose from the chimneys of the town that had once driven her out, but now grudgingly accepted her leadership in building something better. Ruth paused on her doorstep, looking back at the community that had become her home, through choice rather than birth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to mediate between cultures and heal old wounds. But tonight, she was simply a wife and mother coming home to a warm house and a loving family. As they stepped inside and closed the door against the evening chill, Ruth realized that their story had come full circle. They'd begun as strangers in a storm, fleeing violence and hatred. Now they were home, not in the place they'd started, but in the life they'd chosen to build together. She moved to the mantelpiece where Thomas's wedding ring rested in a place of honor, cleaned of blood and polished to a bright gold shine. Beside it sat Ayanna's turquoise pendant, a gift from Tenebah's family, acknowledging her role in bringing justice for the dead. Ruth touched both objects, gently feeling the weight of memory and responsibility they represented. Thomas's ring reminded her that love could survive death, that good people could make terrible mistakes and still be worthy of forgiveness. Ayanna's pendant reminded her that justice was worth fighting for, even when the cost seemed too high to bear. But most importantly, both objects reminded her that the living had obligations to the dead. to remember them truly, to learn from their mistakes, to ensure that their sacrifices led to something better, rather than just more suffering. The storm's reckoning was complete. Truth had triumphed over lies, justice had prevailed over corruption, and 3 people who had started as strangers had become a family forged in fire and ice. What remained was the slow, patient work of peace-building bridges between communities, raising a child who understood that courage was more important than comfort, and proving every day that redemption was possible, even in the hardest ground. Ruth Caldwell had found what she'd been searching for all along, a place to call home, people to call family, and work that gave meaning to the suffering they'd endured. The widow and child who had been cast out to die in a blizzard had not merely survived, they had discovered that sometimes the greatest storms lead to the clearest skies. And in that clarity, they had built something beautiful, lasting, and true.